The October wind whipped across Lake Erie with a ferocity that made Sarah Mitchell pull her jacket tighter as she stepped out of her rental car. Cedar Point's towering roller coasters stretched before her like the skeletal remains of some prehistoric beast, their metal frames cutting sharp silhouettes against the gray Ohio sky. The park had closed for the season 3 weeks ago, leaving behind an eerie stillness that seemed to amplify every sound, the creaking of metal, the distant cry of seagulls, and something else she couldn't quite identify. Sarah adjusted the strap of her equipment bag and approached the main entrance where a security guard waited. At 34, she had investigated dozens of allegedly haunted locations across the country, from abandoned asylums to historic battlefields. Her reputation as a thorough, no-nonsense paranormal investigator had earned her this unusual opportunity, 3 full nights alone in one of America's most famous amusement parks. Ms. Mitchell, the guard, a heavy-set man in his 50s with kind eyes, extended his hand. "I'm Jim Kowalski, head of night security. Mr. Henderson from corporate told me you'd be arriving today." "That's right. Thank you for accommodating this investigation." Sarah shook his hand, noting the slight tremor in his grip. "I understand there have been some unusual incidents reported by your staff." Jim's expression darkened as he unlocked the gate. "More than usual, especially this past season. Maintenance crews hearing children laughing on rides that haven't operated in hours. Security cameras picking up figures moving through areas that should be empty. 3 different employees quit after claiming they saw the same little girl in an old-fashioned dress wandering the midway after closing. They walked through the deserted midway, their footsteps echoing strangely in the vast, empty space. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the rhythmic clanging of loose metal somewhere in the distance. Sarah had expected the typical atmosphere of an abandoned amusement park, slightly melancholy, but ultimately benign. Instead, she felt an undercurrent of something darker, as if the very air held memories of fear and sorrow. "The reports mention specific locations where activity is most concentrated," Sarah said, pulling out her tablet to review her notes. "The Magnum XL 200 area, the old bathhouse site near the beach, and particularly around the Gemini Midway." "That's right." Jim stopped walking and turned to face her. "Look, I've been working security here for 22 years. I've seen plenty of weird stuff. Parks like this, they collect stories, you know. But this season was different. It wasn't just random spookiness. It felt targeted, like something was trying to get our attention." Sarah activated the voice recorder app on her phone. "Can you describe what you personally witnessed?" Jim hesitated, glancing around the empty midway as if expecting to be overheard. 2 weeks before we closed for the season, I was doing my final rounds around midnight. Everything was normal until I reached the Gemini station. That's when I heard it. A child's voice calling for help, clear as day, coming from somewhere near the ride's loading platform. He paused, running a hand through his thinning hair. I followed the voice with my flashlight, checking every corner, every shadow. Nothing there. But then I heard it again, this time coming from the opposite direction, like the sound was moving, leading me somewhere. "Did you follow it?" "I tried to." The voice led me toward the old section of the park, near where the original Cedar Point Hotel used to stand. That's when I saw her. His voice dropped to a whisper. A little girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, wearing this strange dress, all white and puffy, like something from a costume party. She was standing about 50 feet away, just watching me. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. This matched several other eyewitness accounts she had reviewed. "What did you do?" I called out to her, thinking maybe she was a lost kid who somehow got left behind, but when I took a step toward her, she turned and ran. I chased after her with my flashlight, but she just vanished. 1 second she was there, running down the midway, and the next second she was gone. They had reached the center of the park now, surrounded by the towering presence of the Millennium Force and other massive coasters. Sarah could feel the weight of their presence, these monuments to manufactured thrills that seemed somehow ominous in the fading daylight. "There's something else," Jim continued. "The next morning, our grounds crew found footprints in the landscaping near where I saw her, small footprints like a child would make. But here's the thing, it had rained that night, washing away every other mark on the pavement. These prints were the only ones that remained." Sarah made notes on her tablet, her investigator's mind already forming hypotheses. "Has anyone researched the historical records? Sometimes understanding a location's past can provide context for present-day phenomena." "Funny you should ask." Jim reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila folder. "Mr. Henderson asked me to give you this. It's copies of some old documents from the park's archives. Apparently there's quite a collection of historical materials stored in the administrative building. Sarah opened the folder and immediately felt her breath catch. The first item was a black and white photograph, clearly very old, showing 3 children standing in front of what appeared to be the original Cedar Point resort building. The image quality was typical of 1870s photography: formal poses, serious expressions, slightly blurred from long exposure times. But there was something about the children, particularly the youngest one, a girl with long dark hair and an elaborate white dress that made Sarah's skin crawl. "This photograph," she said, studying the image more closely. "Do you know anything about these children?" Jim glanced at the photo and immediately stepped back, as if it had physically repelled him. "That's the one that's been giving everyone the creeps. It was found in the archives about 6 months ago, right around the time the unusual activity started picking up. The girl in the white dress. That's exactly what I saw that night on the Midway." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October wind. The resemblance was unmistakable. The same dress, the same serious expression, even the same pose. It was as if the child in the 150-year-old photograph had somehow stepped out of the frame and into the modern world. As darkness began to settle over Cedar Point, Sarah realized she was about to spend 3 nights investigating something far more complex than a simple haunting. The photograph in her hands seemed to pulse with its own dark energy, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched by eyes that had been waiting patiently for someone exactly like her to arrive. Sarah had set up her base of operations in the Cedar Point Museum, a small building near the main entrance that housed decades of park memorabilia. Jim had provided her with keys to most areas of the park and a detailed map marking the locations where supernatural activity had been reported most frequently. As night fell completely over the empty amusement park, she began her systematic investigation. Her equipment bag contained the latest in paranormal detection technology: digital EMF meters, infrared thermometers, full-spectrum cameras, and highly sensitive audio recorders. She had learned from experience that genuine supernatural phenomena often produced measurable environmental changes, and she approached each case with scientific rigor despite the inherently unscientific nature of ghost hunting. At 9:30 p.m., Sarah began her first sweep of the Gemini area, where Jim had encountered the mysterious child. The massive wooden roller coaster loomed overhead, its twin tracks creating an intricate latte work of shadows in the moonlight. She activated her equipment and started recording, speaking quietly into her handheld recorder. October 15th, 9:32 p.m. Beginning investigation at the Gemini coaster station. Ambient temperature is 47 degrees Fahrenheit. EMF readings are baseline normal. No unusual activity detected at this time. She walked slowly along the platform, where visitors would normally queue for the ride, her infrared thermometer sweeping back and forth. Everything appeared normal until she reached the far end of the station. Suddenly, her EMF detector began beeping rapidly, indicating a significant electromagnetic disturbance. EMF spike detected at the eastern end of the Gemini platform. Reading shows 7.3 milligauss, well above normal background levels. Sarah moved the device in different directions, trying to locate the source of the disturbance. The field appears to be concentrated in a roughly circular area, about 3 feet in diameter. As she knelt to examine the area more closely, her breath formed visible clouds in the suddenly frigid air. Her infrared thermometer confirmed what her body already sensed. The temperature in this specific spot had dropped to 32 degrees, 15 degrees colder than the surrounding area. Then she heard it, a faint sound, almost like whispering, coming from somewhere behind her. Sarah spun around, her flashlight cutting through the darkness, but saw nothing. She stood perfectly still, straining to listen. For several seconds there was only silence. Then the sound came again. Definitely a voice, definitely young, and definitely saying something she couldn't quite understand. "Recording possible EVP at 9:47 p.m., she whispered into her recorder. Female voice. Estimated age between 6 and 10 years old. Source location undetermined. Sarah followed the sound deeper into the Gemini structure, weaving between the massive wooden supports that held up the coaster tracks. Her equipment registered continuous EMF fluctuations and temperature anomalies, as if an invisible presence was moving just ahead of her, always staying beyond the reach of her flashlight beam. The whispering became clearer as she progressed, and Sarah realized with growing unease that it sounded like a child trying to get someone's attention. "Hello? Hello? Can you see me?" The voice was plaintive, almost desperate, carrying an echo quality that suggested it was coming from a great distance, despite seeming to originate just a few feet away. "I can hear you," Sarah called out softly, feeling somewhat foolish but following established protocol for spirit communication. "My name is Sarah. Are you trying to tell me something?" The response was immediate and chilling. The temperature around her plummeted so rapidly that her breath came out in thick puffs, and every piece of equipment she carried began registering off-the-charts readings. Her EMF detector was beeping so rapidly it sounded like a continuous alarm, and her digital camera began taking pictures automatically, as its motion sensors detected movement she couldn't see. "Please don't go," the child's voice said, now clear enough that Sarah could detect a slight accent, something distinctly American but archaic, the way people spoke in old movies from the 1930s and 40s. "I've been waiting so long for someone who could hear me." Sarah's heart was pounding, but her training kept her focused. "How long have you been waiting? What's your name?" "Emma," the voice replied immediately. "Emma Hartwell. I've been here since the beginning, since the very first day. I was with Thomas and Mary when we came for the grand opening. That was such a wonderful day until—" The voice trailed off, and Sarah waited, every nerve in her body on high alert. Her equipment continued to register impossible readings, and she could swear she saw movement in her peripheral vision, a small figure darting between the coaster supports, always staying just outside her direct line of sight. "Until what happened, Emma?" Sarah pressed gently. "Until we found the place where children don't grow old," Emma's voice came back, but now it carried an undertone that made Sarah's blood run cold. There was something wrong with the way she said it, as if the words themselves were tainted with an ancient malevolence. "Would you like to see it? I can show you where Thomas and Mary are waiting. They've missed having someone new to play with." Every instinct Sarah possessed screamed at her to leave immediately. In 15 years of paranormal investigation, she had never encountered anything that felt this genuinely threatening. Whatever Emma was, she wasn't just a residual spirit or harmless apparition. There was intelligence behind the voice, and intention, and something that felt distinctly predatory. "I'd like to learn more about what happened to you and your friends," Sarah said carefully, backing slowly toward the exit of the Gemini structure. "But maybe we could talk somewhere else? Somewhere more comfortable?" Emma's laugh was like broken glass scraping against stone. "Oh, but this is where it all began, Sarah. This is where we first realized we could stay forever. Don't you want to stay forever too? Don't you want to be young and happy and never have to worry about growing old and dying?" Sarah was moving faster now, her equipment bag bouncing against her hip as she hurried toward the open midway. Behind her, she could hear sounds that defied explanation, footsteps that belonged to multiple children, laughter that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, and underneath it all, a low humming sound, like electricity passing through water. She broke free of the coaster structure and found herself back on the main midway, gasping for breath in the comparatively warm night air. Her equipment had returned to normal readings, and the oppressive sense of being watched had lifted. But as she looked back at the Gemini coaster, Sarah could swear she saw small figures moving in the shadows between the support beams, and she knew with absolute certainty that Emma Hartwell was still there, waiting patiently for her return. The first night of her investigation was far from over, but Sarah already understood that she was dealing with something far more dangerous than a simple haunting. Emma wasn't just a ghost. She was something that had been feeding off Cedar Point for 150 years, growing stronger with each passing decade, and now she had found someone who could see and hear her clearly. As Sarah gathered her equipment and prepared to move to the next location, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just made a terrible mistake by announcing her presence to whatever lurked in the shadows of America's roller coaster. Shaken by her encounter with Emma, Sarah retreated to the Cedar Point Museum to review her recordings and plan her next move. The small building felt like a sanctuary compared to the oppressive atmosphere she had experienced at the Gemini coaster. She spread her equipment across a display table and began analyzing the data she had collected. The results were unlike anything in her 15 years of paranormal investigation. Her digital recorder had captured Emma's voice with crystal clarity, but underneath the child's words was something else, a subsonic frequency that registered on her equipment but was below the range of human hearing. Her EMF readings showed patterns that defied conventional explanation, forming geometric shapes that suggested intelligent manipulation of electromagnetic fields. Most disturbing were the photographs her camera had taken automatically during the encounter. While Sarah had seen nothing with her naked eye, The images revealed shadowy figures throughout the Gemini structure. Not just one child, but several, all appearing to be from a different era based on their clothing and poses. And in the background of every photo, barely visible but unmistakably there, was the same little girl from the 1870 photograph. Sarah opened the manila folder Jim had given her and studied the historical image more carefully. The three children stood in front of what appeared to be the original Cedar Point resort building, with Lake Erie visible in the background. Their clothing was formal and expensive, suggesting they came from wealthy families. The two older children, a boy and girl who appeared to be around 10 and 12 years old, stood behind the youngest. But it was Emma who drew Sarah's attention. Even in the faded sepia tones of the century-and-a-half-old photograph, there was something unsettling about her expression. While her companions looked appropriately solemn for the long exposure required by 1870s photography, Emma appeared to be almost smiling. Her eyes, despite the limitations of the old camera, seemed to be looking directly at whoever might view the photograph in the future. Beneath the photograph was a handwritten note in faded ink. Thomas, Mary and Emma Hartwell. Opening day guests, July 4, 1870. Found deceased July 6, 1870. Tragic accident near the old pier foundation. The note was signed, J. Morrison, Resort Manager. Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. The children had died just 2 days after the photograph was taken, during Cedar Point's very first weekend of operation. She quickly pulled out her laptop and began searching for more information about the incident, but found nothing in the standard historical records. It was as if the deaths of 3 children had been deliberately scrubbed from Cedar Point's official history. Determined to learn more, Sarah decided to explore the administrative building where Jim had mentioned additional archives were stored. Using the keys he had provided, she made her way across the darkened park to a nondescript office building near the maintenance area. The night had grown colder, and fog was beginning to roll in from Lake Erie, creating ghostly tendrils that seemed to follow her movement. The administrative building felt different from the moment she entered. While the museum had been merely empty, this place felt actively unwelcoming, as if her presence was an intrusion that would not be tolerated for long. Her EMF detector began registering low-level disturbances immediately, and the temperature inside was at least 10 degrees colder than it should have been. Sarah found the archive room on the 2nd floor, behind a door marked Historical Records, Authorized Personnel Only. Inside, she discovered boxes upon boxes of documents, photographs, and artifacts, dating back to Cedar Point's earliest days. Some of the materials were properly preserved in acid-free containers, but others had simply been stored haphazardly, as if someone had wanted to hide them rather than preserve them. She began with the box labeled 1870-1875 and immediately found what she was looking for. A thick folder contained incident reports, correspondence and newspaper clippings related to the Hartwell children's deaths. As Sarah read through the documents, a horrifying picture began to emerge. According to the original police report, Thomas, Mary and Emma Hartwell had been found dead near the foundation of an old pier that had been partially demolished to make room for the resort's expansion. The children appeared to have been playing in the area despite warnings from their parents and resort staff. The official cause of death was listed as drowning, but the circumstances were puzzling. The children had been found in shallow water, no more than 3 feet deep, and all 3 were experienced swimmers according to their family. More troubling, they had been discovered holding hands in a circle, as if they had been performing some kind of ritual or game when they died. Their bodies showed no signs of struggle or trauma other than water in their lungs, but it was the witness statements that made Sarah's blood run cold. Multiple guests had reported seeing the 3 children playing near the old pier foundation on the morning of July the 6th, laughing and apparently having a wonderful time. However, when their bodies were discovered that afternoon, the resort physician estimated they had been dead for at least 12 hours, meaning they had died sometime during the previous night, yet had been seen alive and active the following morning. The resort manager, J. Morrison, had tried to suppress the incident to prevent damage to Cedar Point's reputation during its crucial opening season. The children's wealthy parents had been quietly compensated. The bodies had been removed for burial in Cleveland, and all records of the incident had been sealed. The old pier foundation had been completely demolished and filled in within a week of the deaths. Sarah found several more documents that suggested Morrison believed something supernatural had been responsible for the children's deaths. In a private letter to the resort's owner, he wrote, "The Hartwell incident has convinced me that we built this place on cursed ground. The children spoke of hearing voices calling to them from beneath the old pier, and several guests reported seeing figures moving in the water at night. I fear we have awakened something that should have been left undisturbed. As Sarah photographed the documents with her phone, she began to understand the true scope of what she was dealing with. Emma Hartwell wasn't just the ghost of a child who had died tragically. She was something that had been created by whatever malevolent force existed at Cedar Point. The same force that had killed her and her siblings in 1870 was still active, still hungry, and still luring victims to their doom. The archive room suddenly grew much colder, and Sarah's breath began forming visible clouds. Her EMF detector started beeping frantically, and she heard a sound that made her freeze in terror. Children's laughter, coming from somewhere in the walls around her. Not just Emma's voice this time, but multiple children, all laughing together as if they were sharing the most delightful secret. "Sarah," Emma's voice whispered from directly behind her, "you're learning so much about us. Isn't it wonderful? Now you know how we became what we are. And soon, very soon, you'll understand how you can join us." Sarah spun around, but the room appeared empty. However, her camera began taking automatic pictures, and when she glanced at the LCD screen, she could see them, dozens of children from different eras, all crowding around her, all reaching out with translucent hands as if trying to touch her. She grabbed her equipment and ran for the door, but it slammed shut before she could reach it. The laughter grew louder, more intense, and Sarah realized with growing horror that she was trapped in a room with the spirits of every child who had died at Cedar Point over the past 150 years. And at the center of them all, clearly visible now even without her camera, stood Emma Hartwell, no longer the innocent child from the photograph, but something ancient and terrible that wore the face of youth while harboring the accumulated malevolence of a century and a half of feeding on human fear and despair. The archive room had become a supernatural prison, with Sarah trapped among the spirits of children who had died at Cedar Point across 15 decades. The temperature had plummeted to near freezing, and her breath came out in thick clouds as she pressed her back against the locked door. Through her camera's LCD screen, she could see them clearly now. Dozens of young faces from different eras, all bearing the same expression of eager anticipation. Emma Hartwell stood at the center of the ghostly gathering, and up close Sarah could see that the child was far more terrifying than any adult spirit she had ever encountered. While Emma maintained the appearance of an 8-year-old girl, her eyes held an ancient intelligence and a hunger that seemed to stretch back through the centuries. Her white dress, which had appeared pristine in the 1870 photograph, was now stained with something dark that looked suspiciously like dried blood. "Don't be frightened, Sarah," Emma said, her voice carrying that same archaic accent but now layered with undertones that seemed to come from multiple throats. "We've been waiting so long for someone like you, someone who could see us clearly, hear us properly, and help us grow our family." The other children began moving closer, forming a tight circle around Sarah. She could see them from different decades. A boy in 1920s knickers and suspenders, a girl in a 1950s poodle skirt, children in clothing from the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and beyond. All of them had died at Cedar Point, and all of them had been claimed by whatever dark force Emma represented. "You're not really Emma Hartwell, are you?" Sarah managed to say, her voice shaking as she clutched her equipment bag. "Emma died in 1870. You're something else, something that's been using her identity." Emma's childish giggle was like nails on a chalkboard. "Oh, but I am Emma, dear Sarah. I'm just much more than I was when that photograph was taken. When Thomas, Mary, and I found the old foundation beneath the pier, we discovered something wonderful, a place where children could play forever, where we never had to grow up, never had to face the boring adult world." "What did you find down there?" "The remnants of an older settlement, much older than Cedar Point. The Native Americans who lived here before the white settlers knew about it. They called it the Hungry Place, where the spirits of drowned children gathered to lure others into the water. We didn't understand at first. We just heard beautiful singing coming from beneath the foundation stones." Sarah's EMF detector was registering readings so high they should have been impossible. The electromagnetic disturbance was so intense that her other equipment was beginning to malfunction. But she needed to keep Emma talking, needed to understand what she was dealing with. "The singing convinced you to go into the water? The singing promised us eternal childhood, eternal play, eternal joy. And it delivered on that promise, Sarah. When we drowned that night, we didn't die, we transformed. We became part of something much larger, much more powerful, and over the years we've helped other children make the same wonderful transformation. The circle of ghostly children began closing in, and Sarah could feel the temperature dropping even further. Frost was beginning to form on the windows, and her breath was coming in short, panicked gasps. Through her camera, she could see that the children's eyes were no longer reflecting any trace of humanity. They glowed with a cold, predatory light that spoke of an insatiable hunger. "Every decade we've grown stronger," Emma continued. "Every child who dies here becomes part of our family. The drownings, the accidents, the mysterious disappearances, all of it feeds the hungry place, and all of it makes us more powerful." Cedar Point has become the perfect hunting ground, with thousands of children visiting every year. The park authorities must know something is wrong, the pattern of accidents. Oh, they suspect. But what can they do? Close down one of America's most profitable theme parks because of ghost stories. They've learned to manage the incidents, cover them up, compensate the families quietly. As long as we don't take too many, as long as we space out our feeding, they're willing to look the other way. Sarah realized with growing horror that she was learning about a supernatural conspiracy that had been operating for over a century. Cedar Point wasn't just haunted. It was actively being used as a feeding ground by something that had learned to blend into the modern world while maintaining its ancient hunger. "Why me?" Sarah asked. "Why show yourselves to me now?" Emma's smile revealed teeth that were no longer quite human. They were too sharp, too numerous, and they seemed to shift and move in her mouth like living things. "Because you're special, Sarah. You have the gift of true sight, the ability to see through the veil between worlds. We need someone like you to help us expand our operations." "Expand how?" "Cedar Point is just the beginning. There are amusement parks all across America, all filled with happy children just waiting to join our eternal playground. But we need someone from your world, someone who can travel freely and help us establish new feeding grounds. Someone who can lure investigators and thrill seekers to places where we can claim them without suspicion." The ghostly children were now close enough that Sarah could feel their presence as a physical weight pressing against her. Their faces had begun to change, showing their true nature beneath the facade of innocent youth. Their skin was mottled and waterlogged, their eyes were solid black pits, and their mouths opened far too wide, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. "Join us willingly, Sarah," Emma said, extending one small pale hand. "Become our agent in the living world. Help us spread the joy of eternal childhood to every corner of America. The alternative is much less pleasant." Sarah looked around the circle of monstrous children and realized that she was facing something far beyond a simple haunting or even a malevolent spirit. This was an ancient evil that had learned to adapt and evolve, using the modern world's fascination with thrill-seeking and supernatural tourism to expand its influence. Emma and her siblings weren't just ghosts. They were predators who had discovered the perfect camouflage. "What happens if I refuse?" Sarah asked, though she already suspected the answer. Emma's childish facade finally dropped completely, revealing something that belonged in humanity's darkest nightmares. Her face elongated into something vaguely aquatic. Her skin became translucent enough to show the dark shapes moving beneath it, and her voice became a chorus of drowning children from across the centuries. "Then you become our newest family member, Sarah. And tomorrow night, when the next paranormal investigator arrives to solve the mystery of your disappearance, you'll help us welcome them to our eternal playground." The circle of children began closing in for the final time, their hands reaching out to claim another victim for the hungry place. Sarah realized that she had perhaps seconds before she joined the ranks of Cedar Point's supernatural predators, and that her only chance of escape lay in understanding something about the entity that Emma had become, something that might give her the key to breaking free from this nightmare. As the circle of monstrous children closed in around her, Sarah's mind raced through everything she had learned about the entities. They were bound to Cedar Point, connected to the original foundation beneath the old pier, and they seemed to draw power from the electromagnetic disturbances she had been measuring. More importantly, they had revealed themselves fully only after she had found the historical documents, which suggested they were vulnerable to exposure of the truth. With seconds left before the ghostly hands reached her, Sarah grabbed the manila folder containing the 1870 incident reports and held it up like a shield. "I know what you really are," she shouted. "You're not children at all. You're parasites that feed on the essence of youth." Emma's transformed face contorted with rage, and for a moment the circle hesitated. Sarah pressed her advantage, pulling out her phone and activating its camera flash repeatedly. The original incident report says the Hartwell children were found holding hands in a circle, just like you're doing now. But they had been dead for 12 hours when people saw them playing that morning. You were never human. You just took their forms. The strobing camera flash seemed to cause the spirits physical pain. They recoiled with sounds like steam escaping from a boiler, and their translucent forms became even more unstable. Sarah realized that bright light disrupted whatever energy allowed them to maintain their coherent manifestations. The Native Americans called it the hungry place because it consumes life force, Sarah continued, backing toward the window while keeping her phone's light aimed at the spirits. You're not ghosts. You're some kind of psychic parasite that mimics human children to lure victims. That's why you need amusement parks, places where children's excitement and life energy are concentrated. Emma's voice became a shriek that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. You understand nothing. We offer eternal joy, eternal childhood. We save them from growing up, from disappointment, from death. You offer slavery, Sarah shot back. Look at them. They're not playing or happy. They're your hunting pack, forced to lure other children to feed your hunger. The other spirits were becoming increasingly agitated, their forms flickering between the innocent faces they wore as masks and the aquatic horrors beneath. Sarah could see now that they weren't individual entities at all, but extensions of whatever central consciousness had taken Emma's identity as its primary avatar. Sarah reached the window and used her equipment bag to smash through the glass. The October night air rushed in, carrying with it the sound of wind through the roller coaster structures and the distant crash of waves against the Lake Erie shore. More importantly, it brought moonlight, natural illumination that seemed to weaken the spirits even more than her artificial flash. The moonlight, Sarah realized. You can only maintain full manifestation in artificial environments. That's why all the sightings happen inside buildings or under the park structures. Emma's form was beginning to lose cohesion, becoming more translucent and less defined. You cannot escape us, Sarah. We are part of this place now. Every shadow, every reflection, every whisper of wind through the rides, we are everywhere. Sarah climbed through the broken window onto a narrow maintenance balcony that ran along the building's exterior. The drop to the ground was about 12 feet, survivable but risky. Behind her, she could hear the spirits regrouping, their angry voices merging into a sound like rushing water. Even if you flee tonight, Emma's voice followed her through the window, you carry our mark now. You've seen us, heard us, felt our touch. That connection will never fade. Wherever you go, we can find you. And we will find you, Sarah. We will hunt you across every amusement park in America until you submit to us. Sarah looked down at the drop, then back at the window where she could see the ghostly children beginning to merge into a single, massive entity. Their individual forms were dissolving into something that looked like a vast aquatic predator made of mist and malevolence. She had perhaps seconds before it recovered enough to pursue her. There's something you don't understand about me, Sarah called back to the entity. I've spent 15 years hunting things like you. I've faced demons, poltergeists, and spirits that would make your collection of stolen children look like a daycare center. And I've learned something important about entities that feed on fear and despair. She pulled out a small device from her equipment bag, a modified EMF generator that she had built specifically for dealing with electromagnetic sensitive supernatural phenomena. They're all cowards when you fight back. Sarah activated the device and hurled it through the window into the archive room. The EMF generator began producing a rapid series of electromagnetic pulses designed to disrupt spectral manifestations. The effect on the merged entity was immediate and devastating. It let out a scream like 1,000 children crying in unison and began to dissolve back into its component spirits. Using the distraction, Sarah dropped from the balcony to the ground below, rolling to absorb the impact. Pain shot through her left ankle, but she could still walk. She gathered her remaining equipment and began running toward the park's main entrance, guided by the distant glow of the security lighting. Behind her, she could hear the entity recovering from the electromagnetic assault. Its voice echoed across the empty midway, no longer trying to maintain the facade of childish innocence. Run, Sarah Mitchell. Run back to your safe little world. But remember, we know who you are now. We know where you live, where you work, who you care about. This is not over. This will never be over. Sarah reached her rental car and drove away from Cedar Point with her hands shaking on the steering wheel. In her rearview mirror, she could see lights moving through the park, not the warm glow of normal illumination, but the cold, predatory gleam of something ancient and hungry resuming its eternal hunt. As she reached the highway, Sarah realized that her investigation had uncovered something far more dangerous than she had imagined. Cedar Point wasn't just haunted. It was home to a parasitic entity that had been feeding on children for over a century, growing stronger and more sophisticated with each passing decade. And now, by exposing its nature and fighting back, she had made herself its primary target. The entity, calling itself Emma Hartwell, had been telling the truth about one thing. This was far from over. Sarah had escaped the immediate trap, but she had also declared war on something that had the patience of eternity and the cunning of a predator that had perfected its hunting techniques across multiple generations. As she drove through the Ohio night toward what she hoped would be safety, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed by eyes that never blinked and a hunger that would never be satisfied until it had claimed her as its newest recruit in an army of stolen souls. Sarah drove through the night, putting as much distance as possible between herself and Cedar Point. She had abandoned her original plan to spend 3 nights investigating the park. One encounter with the entity, masquerading as Emma Hartwell, had been more than enough. But as the miles rolled by, she began to realize that escape might not be as simple as leaving Ohio behind. Her phone had been buzzing with notifications since she left the park, and when she finally pulled into a rest stop near Toledo to check the messages, what she found made her blood run cold. Her social media accounts were being flooded with friend requests from profiles using the names of children who had died at various amusement parks across the country. The profile pictures showed vintage photographs of young faces, all with the same predatory gleam in their eyes that she had seen in Emma's transformed visage. But it was the private messages that truly terrified her. Dozens of them, all from different accounts, all saying the same thing. "We're coming to play, Sarah. We know where you live." Her home address in Portland, Oregon was listed in several of the messages, along with details about her daily routine that no internet stalker should have been able to obtain. They knew which coffee shop she visited every morning, which grocery store she preferred, even the name of her elderly neighbor's cat. The entity had somehow accessed information that should have been completely private. Sarah's hands were shaking as she tried to call her colleague Marcus Webb, a fellow paranormal investigator who specialized in protective measures against supernatural threats. But her phone seemed to be malfunctioning. Every call was answered by the sound of children laughing, even when she tried to reach completely unrelated numbers. She abandoned the phone and got back on the road, but now she noticed something that made her stomach clench with fear. In her rearview mirror, barely visible in the pre-dawn darkness, she could see lights following her, not the steady glow of normal headlights, but the cold, flickering illumination she had witnessed at Cedar Point. The entity wasn't bound to the amusement park as she had hoped. It was somehow able to project itself along the highways, tracking her like a supernatural bloodhound. As Sarah reached the outskirts of Cleveland, the pursuit became more aggressive. Her car radio began picking up signals that shouldn't have existed, children's voices singing nursery rhymes with lyrics that had been twisted into threats. "Sarah, Sarah," running away, but the children want Sarah to come and play. "Hide and seek, ready or not. Emma's coming to your favorite spot." The temperature inside her car began dropping, and frost started forming on the inside of her windows despite the October warmth. Through the frosted glass, Sarah could see shapes moving alongside her vehicle, translucent figures of children running at impossible speeds, keeping pace with her car on the highway. Their mouths were open as if they were laughing, but no sound reached her except the rhythmic thumping of their spectral feet on the asphalt. Sarah pressed harder on the accelerator, pushing her rental car to its limits, but the ghostly parade continued to match her speed effortlessly. Worse, she began to see more of them appearing ahead of her on the highway, dozens of children from different eras, all beckoning for her to stop, all wearing the same expression of hungry anticipation. As she approached the Cleveland airport, hoping to catch the first flight back to Portland, Sarah realized that traditional methods of escape weren't going to work. The entity had evolved far beyond the typical geographic limitations of most supernatural phenomena. It had learned to use modern technology, transportation networks and communication systems to extend its reach across vast distances. Her car's GPS system suddenly activated on its own, displaying a route that led not to the airport, but back toward Lake Erie. The mechanical voice that normally provided directions had been replaced by Emma's childish tones. "Recalculating route. Take the next exit to return to your new playmates. Estimated arrival time. Forever." Sarah manually shut off the GPS and continued toward the airport. But now the streetlights along the highway began strobing in patterns that reminded her of the electromagnetic disturbances she had measured at Cedar Point. The entity was somehow interfacing with the electrical infrastructure, turning the entire city into an extension of its hunting ground. At the airport, Sarah discovered that every flight to Portland had been mysteriously cancelled due to technical difficulties. When she tried to book a ticket to any other destination, the computer systems kept glitching, displaying error messages that read, "Destination not found, please return to playground," in a font that looked like a child's crayon writing. The airport security cameras were following her movement, swiveling to track her progress through the terminal, despite the fact that they should have been fixed position devices. On the monitors scattered throughout the waiting areas, instead of the usual arrival and departure information, Sarah could see surveillance footage of herself from Cedar Point, not just from the previous night, but from every moment of her investigation, including angles that should have been impossible to capture. As she sat in the airport restaurant trying to figure out her next move, Sarah noticed that the other travelers were beginning to stare at her with expressions of vacant curiosity. Their eyes had taken on a familiar, cold gleam, and she realized with growing horror that the entity was somehow able to influence or possess ordinary people when it focused its attention on a specific target. A little girl at a nearby table, no more than 6 years old, turned around and spoke to Sarah in Emma's voice. "You can't run from us, Sarah. We're everywhere now. Every child you see, every playground you pass, every amusement park in America, we're waiting in all of them. Join us willingly and we'll make your transformation pleasant. Continue to resist, and we'll show you what real fear looks like." The child's parents seemed oblivious to the fact that their daughter had just spoken in the voice of a malevolent entity. They continued eating their breakfast as if nothing unusual had happened, but Sarah could see that their eyes had also taken on that empty, influenced look. Sarah left the restaurant and found a quiet corner of the terminal where she could think without being observed. She was dealing with something that had far exceeded her expectations of what supernatural entities could accomplish. This wasn't just a local haunting or even a particularly powerful spirit. This was something that had learned to interface with modern technology and human consciousness on a scale she had never encountered. Her investigation at Cedar Point had awakened something that had been content to feed locally for 150 years. Now it had set its sights on expanding its hunting grounds across the entire country, and it had chosen her as both its primary target and its unwilling scout for new feeding locations. As Sarah sat in the airport terminal, surrounded by increasingly hostile strangers and cut off from normal means of escape, she realized that she was no longer just investigating a paranormal phenomenon. She was the prey in a supernatural hunt that would not end until she found a way to destroy the entity, or became another addition to its collection of stolen souls. The war between Sarah Mitchell and the thing that called itself Emma Hartwell had begun in earnest, and the battlefield was no longer limited to a single amusement park in Ohio. The entity had brought the fight to her. And now every public space, every electronic device, and every child she encountered was a potential weapon in its arsenal. Trapped in the Cleveland airport with no safe means of escape, Sarah made a desperate decision. If conventional travel was compromised, she would have to find another way to fight back. She rented a car using cash and drove to the Cleveland Public Library, one of the few places she hoped might offer some protection through its combination of public space, academic resources, and, ironically, its lack of modern electronic infrastructure in the older sections. The main library building, constructed in the 1920s, felt like stepping back in time. The older reading rooms still used traditional card catalogs and microfilm readers, technology that predated the entity's apparent ability to manipulate modern digital systems. Sarah settled into a corner desk in the historical research section and began investigating the true scope of what she was facing. Using the library's genealogy databases and historical newspaper archives, Sarah started mapping incidents at amusement parks across America. What she discovered was a pattern of unexplained deaths and disappearances that stretched back over a century, following the expansion of the entertainment industry from coast to coast. The pattern wasn't random. Every major amusement park in the United States had experienced a cluster of mysterious incidents within the first few years of its operation. Coney Island in the 1880s, Riverview Park in Chicago in the 1900s, Kennywood in Pittsburgh in the 1910s. All of them had documented cases of children dying or vanishing, under circumstances that defied logical explanation. More disturbing was the discovery that many of these incidents occurred near water features, lakes, ponds, fountains, or areas where bodies of water had previously existed. The entity seemed to require some connection to drowning, to the original hungry place that had claimed the real Emma Hartwell and her siblings in 1870. Sarah found newspaper clippings that described children being found in circles, holding hands, in shallow water, where drowning should have been impossible. Witness reports of children playing happily hours after they had been discovered dead, families who received unusual compensation from park management to keep incidents quiet. The pattern was consistent across multiple states and decades. But the most chilling discovery came when Sarah began researching more recent incidents. The frequency was increasing. What had once been isolated events occurring every few years at individual parks had become a coordinated network of supernatural predation. Modern amusement parks like Six Flags, Disney World, and Universal Studios all had documented cases of children disappearing or dying under mysterious circumstances, but the incidents were being covered up more effectively than ever before. Sarah accessed insurance databases and found something that made her hands shake. There was a consulting firm called Hartwell Risk Management that specialized in handling unusual liability claims for the entertainment industry. The company had been established in 1995 and had contracts with virtually every major amusement park in America. Their specialty was managing incidents involving unexplained phenomena and ensuring that such cases were resolved quietly without media attention. The company's founder was listed as E. Hartwell, with no additional biographical information available. Sarah didn't need to guess who was behind the mysterious firm. The entity had learned to operate within the modern business world, providing a service that allowed amusement parks to continue operating despite supernatural predation, while ensuring that the incidents were documented and managed to maximize the entity's feeding opportunities. As Sarah printed out her research, she realized she was looking at evidence of a supernatural conspiracy that spanned the entire American entertainment industry. The entity wasn't just hunting at Cedar Point, it was operating a nationwide network that had been growing stronger and more sophisticated for over a century. Her investigation was interrupted by a commotion in the children's section of the library. Sarah looked up to see a group of young children standing motionless among the picture books, all staring directly at her despite being 2 floors below and across the building. Their eyes had the same cold gleam she had seen in the airport, and she could hear their voices echoing through the building's ventilation system. "Sarah's learning so much," they chanted in unison. "Sarah's such a smart investigator, but Sarah can't hide in old buildings forever. Sarah needs to come out and play." The library's electronic systems began malfunctioning. Computer screens flickered with images of children playing in amusement parks. The automated checkout system started beeping frantically, and the building's emergency lighting activated despite no apparent emergency. Other patrons began looking around in confusion, but their eyes were already taking on that influenced, vacant expression Sarah had learned to recognize. She gathered her research and headed for the library's emergency exit, but found her path blocked by a security guard, whose badge read, E. Hartwell Security Services. The guard's face was blank, his movements unnaturally stiff, and when he spoke, it was in Emma's voice. "You've learned so much about our business operations, Sarah. We're quite impressed with your investigative skills. But you've also learned things that could disrupt our carefully established partnerships with the entertainment industry. That's not acceptable." Sarah backed away from the possessed guard, but found that other library patrons were beginning to surround her. Men, women, and children of all ages, all moving with the same mechanical precision, all staring at her with those cold, hungry eyes. "We've been building this network for 150 years, Emma's voice continued, now speaking through multiple people simultaneously. "We've learned to work within your human systems to provide services that make our feeding both profitable and sustainable. Amusement parks need our risk management services, insurance companies need our expertise in handling unusual claims, and we need the steady supply of young life force that the entertainment industry provides." Sarah realized she was looking at the true scope of the entity's evolution. It hadn't just learned to hunt more effectively, it had learned to integrate itself into human society as a necessary business partner. The thing that called itself Emma Hartwell had become the supernatural equivalent of a corporation, with branches in every major entertainment center in America. "Join our management team, Sarah," the possessed crowd continued. Use your investigative skills to help us identify new hunting grounds. Help us expand into international markets. The theme park industry is global now, and we need someone with your expertise to help us establish operations in Europe, Asia, and beyond. Sarah spotted a fire axe mounted on the wall near the emergency exit and grabbed it, not because she thought it would be effective against supernatural entities, but because the shock of a normal person wielding a weapon might disrupt whatever influence the entity was exerting over the library patrons. Her gamble worked. The sight of the axe seemed to break the entity's control over several of the possessed individuals, who suddenly looked around in confusion, as if waking from a dream. In the moment of chaos that followed, Sarah smashed through the emergency exit and found herself in an alley behind the library. But even as she ran toward her rental car, Sarah could hear Emma's laughter echoing from every storm drain, every shadow, every reflection in the windows of passing cars. The entity had revealed the true scale of its operations, and now Sarah understood that she wasn't just fighting a single supernatural predator. She was up against something that had become an integral part of the American entertainment industry. As she drove away from Cleveland, Sarah knew that her only hope of stopping the entity lay in understanding its original nature and finding whatever weakness had allowed it to be contained to Cedar Point for its first century of existence. The thing calling itself Emma Hartwell had grown far beyond its original form, but somewhere in its transformation, there might still be a vulnerability that could be exploited. The question was whether Sarah could find that weakness before the entity's nationwide network succeeded in tracking her down and adding her to its collection of supernatural employees. Sarah drove south through Ohio, avoiding major highways where the entity's influence seemed strongest. She needed to find someone who understood the historical context of what she was facing, a researcher or historian who might have knowledge about the Native American legends Emma had mentioned. Her destination was Ohio State University, where she hoped to locate Professor Margaret Two Bears, an expert in Great Lakes tribal folklore. The drive gave Sarah time to process what she had learned about the entity's evolution. It had started as something the Native Americans called the hungry place, a supernatural phenomenon associated with drowning children. Over 150 years, it had transformed from a localized spiritual threat into a business entity that operated nationwide. But growth on that scale suggested it had found a way to reproduce or expand that went beyond its original nature. Professor Two Bears worked out of the university's anthropology department, and Sarah found her in her office late that evening, grading papers by lamplight. The professor was a woman in her 60s with silver-streaked hair and eyes that seemed to take in far more than they revealed. When Sarah explained her situation, Professor Two Bears listened without skepticism, as if supernatural encounters were a normal part of academic research. "The hungry place," Professor Two Bears said, setting down her pen and leaning back in her chair. "My grandmother's people, the Seneca, had stories about such places around the Great Lakes, water spirits that fed on the life force of children, usually appearing where violent deaths had occurred in or near the water." Emma mentioned that the Native Americans knew about it before Cedar Point was built. What exactly were they dealing with? Not a single entity, but rather a type of spiritual predator that emerges in specific environmental conditions. These things are drawn to places where children have drowned, especially if the deaths were traumatic or involved some kind of ritual or sacrifice. They feed on the terror and life energy released during drowning, and they use that energy to create false manifestations of the victims. Professor Two Bears opened a filing cabinet and pulled out several manila folders filled with handwritten notes and photocopied documents. The traditional stories describe these entities as shapeshifters that can mimic human children perfectly, but they're actually more like psychic parasites. They consume the essence of youth and innocence, growing stronger with each feeding. How were they traditionally dealt with? That's where it gets complicated. The tribal stories suggest that these entities can be contained through specific rituals, but not permanently destroyed. They're too closely connected to the natural cycle of death and renewal in aquatic environments. The best that could be accomplished was binding them to specific locations and warning future generations to avoid those areas.